call it Piso one more time. This is part 4 of the historical Jesus. Let's begin. Dr. Lena Einhorn says that Josephus, Flavius Piso / Arius Piso did not like these people, who were the extreme religious Jews at the time. Mr. Piso was also from the same people. Let's get some background. Flavius Josephus, the Jewish historian, by Laurel Gibb. December 3rd, 2021 news. Summary. For centuries, the complete works of Flavius Josephus, the Jewish historian, was one of the most widely read books in the English-speaking world besides the Bible. Josephus, 37 to 100 AD, witnessed and recorded the devastating destruction of the Second Jerusalem Temple by Rome and the very beginnings of Christianity. Who was Flavius Josephus? The fascinating and ambiguous man that we often quote in reference to biblical history. And Jesus said to him, "Do you see these great buildings? There would not be left here one stone upon another that would not be thrown down." Mark 13:2. Side note, this was not a prophecy of the fall of the Jewish temple in 70 AD. Mr. Piso wrote this into the New Testament after the fact and also participated in that war as well. Joseph, son of Matthias from Jerusalem. Titus Flavius Josephus was born in Jerusalem in 37 AD as Joseph ben Mattiyahu. He lived during a momentous period of Judaism and Christianity. His eyewitness accounts are invaluable history that make mention of Jesus and his brother James, Antiquities 20.200, and add important information concerning the social, political, and religious backgrounds of the New Testament. Josephus was born into an elite and wealthy family of Jewish priests. On his father's side, he was the descendant of the high priest Israel Jonathan Aphus, who was also the leader of the Hasmonean dynasty of Judea from 160 to 143 BC. Aphus was part of the priestly order of Jehoiarib, the first of the 24 orders of priests originally set up by King David, 1 Chronicles 24:7. Josephus' mother was a descendant from the royal Hasmonean dynasty. Josephus had an older brother named Matthias after their father. Spiritual quest. Josephus claimed that he was recognized for his undertakings of Jewish law at age 14 and age 16, went on a 3-year spiritual quest, spending time learning about the 3 main Jewish factions: the Sadducees, Pharisees, and Essenes. Wisely, he makes no mention of spending time with the radical rebellious group, the Zealots. The Sadducees were priests and aristocrats concerned with temple rituals who disappeared after its destruction in 70 AD. The Pharisees were a Jewish sect that stressed a strict observance of the written law, Torah, as well as the oral law, which would later be written in the Talmud. They would assemble for teaching and prayer in synagogues and consequently were able to continue after the temple was gone. The Essenes lived in a monastic life in the desert with strictly celibacy and dietary laws, and most scholars believe they were responsible for the Dead Sea Scrolls that were found in 1947 in the Qumran caves. During this time of seeking, Josephus lived in the desert with his teacher, banished at age 19. Josephus returned to Jerusalem, having decided to align himself with the Pharisees. When Josephus was around the age 26, he traveled to Rome to make a plea to Emperor Nero to free priests who was imprisoned there. Nero's wife, Poppaea, took a liking to him, and with the help of the Jewish stage actor, Josephus was successful in gaining the release of the priests. Josephus was impressed with the amazing architecture and advancement of Rome. When he arrived back to Jerusalem, the Jewish war was just starting. Military commander of Galilee, Josephus was in his mid-20s in 66 AD when the first Roman War broke out. During the 12th year of Nero's reign, this was the first of three major rebellions by the Jews against the Roman Empire. The second being the Kitos War, 115 AD to 117 AD, and the third, the Bar Kokhba Revolt, 132 to 136 AD. The devastating result of this first revolt was the complete destruction of the Jewish temple in 70 AD, resulting in the end of the Jewish sacrificial system. The war was over April 1673 AD at the siege of Masada, where 960 Jews committed suicide rather than be taken as prisoners. Josephus said, "I fail to see how victory over a feeble enemy can be any indication of power." Josephus, The Jewish War, 1.8. When the Jewish revolt against Rome began, Josephus was chosen to be the military governor over Galilee, a position he made clear he did not want because he knew it was impossible for the Jews to win against Rome. His job was to fortify towns and villages in preparation for a Roman attack. Josephus' first battle was at a village called Arius, which he wrote about extensively. His army was pushed back to Yotfat, also called Jotapata. In July 67 AD, after a 47-day siege at the Jewish town of Yotfat, his army was overrun. The Romans killed thousands and survivors committed suicide, which for the Jews at the time was considered noble. Josephus recorded that he was trapped in a cave with 40 others who had pledged to kill themselves rather than become slaves to Rome. Josephus opposed this idea and suggested drawing lots to kill each other one at a time instead of commit suicide. The Jewish War, chapter 3, verse 8. Coincidentally, or not so coincidentally, Josephus and one of other were the last alive and chosen to surrender to the Roman commander, Flavius Vespasian, prophet or traitor. As a prisoner, Josephus claimed to have had a vision from God that Vespasian would become emperor, saying that it was revealed to him that God was using Rome to punish the Jewish people, and he himself had been chosen to announce these things. This so-called revelation did not go unnoticed by his fellow Jews as extremely self-serving. Side note, this action will be revisited later as it relates to the New Testament. After Vespasian did indeed become emperor, he released Josephus in 69 AD, considering him to have the gift of prophecy. Josephus then acted as a negotiator during the siege of Jerusalem in 70 AD, where his parents were being held hostage by a rebel faction leader, Simon Bar Giora, Jewish prisoner to Roman citizen. In AD 71, Josephus went to Rome with Vespasian's son, Titus, and was granted Roman citizenship and the family name, Titus Flavius Josephus. His historical works were written in Rome under Flavian support. He was awarded a pension, a captive Jewish wife, and a place to live in defeated Judea. His married life was tumultuous. He divorced his first wife not long after they were married and took his second wife only to have her leave him. His third wife was an Alexandrian Jew whom he had 3 sons with, but only one survived childhood, Flavius Hyrcanus. Then in AD 75, after divorcing his third wife, he married a fourth, a distinguished Greek Jewish woman from Crete, with whom he had 2 more sons, Flavius Justus and Flavius Simonides Agrippa. The writings of Flavius Josephus wrote 4 main works that are major sources of information to us today about the history and life of Jews and Christians in the first century. His first works, The Jewish War, was written AD 75. The account starts with the period of the Maccabees and ends with the fall of Jerusalem. His second and longest work, A Jewish Antiquities, is 21 volumes in length and was completed in AD 94. where Josephus gives a defense of the Jewish people by outlining the great accomplishment of Old Testament heroes such as Abraham and Moses. Against Apion is a 2-volume work that compares the longevity of the Jewish religion with the relatively recent traditions of the Greeks. It is the book Against Apion Flavius Josephus, translated by William Winston. The life of Josephus is an autobiography thought to possibly be an appendix to his book Antiquity, where Josephus retells parts of the Jewish War. Josephus adds important details to the dates given in the New Testament by linking Caesar Augustus, who called for the census of the Jews in Luke 2, with Herod the Great, who the Magi visited on their way to see Jesus. Josephus writes about other biblical figures such as John the Baptist, who he confirms was beheaded by Herod Antipas. He mentions Roman emperors Tiberius, Luke 3:1, Gaius Claudius, Acts 11:28, Acts 18:2, Acts 23:26, Nero, Vespasian, and Titus, who ruled Rome during the early church. Josephus writes about Roman prefects Pontius Pilate, Antonius Felix, and Porcius Festus, whose name we see in the New Testament books of Luke and Acts. Other details are filled in concerning biblical figures and institutions such as the Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, Sanhedrin, the Tetrarchy of Philip, and the institution of high priests. There is a controversial passage about Jesus Christ found in Antiquities, chapter 18:3 and chapter 3, called Testimonium Flavianum. Part of it says Jesus was a wise teacher who won over many Jews and Greeks, was condemned to die on a cross, and the tribe of the Christians, so called after him, will still to this day not disappear. Some phrases about Jesus being the Messiah and having accomplished surprising feats are thoughts by many to be added on by Christian copyists because they would likely be unlikely statements coming from a Jew. Side note, this too will be addressed by the Bible interpretation and explanations. Where Josephus' information can be compared to other sources and archaeological evidence, he is seen to be extremely accurate for events in his own time and for history recent to his life. When it comes to earlier biblical history such as the Exodus and the kings of Israel and Judah, he is less reliable, sometimes making inaccurate or contradictory statements. However, he writes that he had access to ancient Jewish documents, including early copies of the Bible that have since been destroyed. This makes his writing an intriguing source for investigators of early biblical history, where one cannot be sure if a recorded detail is an invention or an unwarranted conclusion or an accurately preserved account passed down from ancient Jewish sources. Side note, this too will be addressed. Conclusion: Josephus was an ambiguous figure who we know about from his own writers. He claimed to be a prophet, but his own people saw him as a traitor. He saw the hopelessness of fighting against Rome and starting out as a reluctant Jewish military leader, ended up switching to the Roman side. There are many different ways to view him, and no matter how we do, we are still indebted to him for his accounts given as a Jewish man who lived in Rome in the 1st century and witnessed the catastrophic destruction of Jerusalem firsthand and the horrible persecution of the early Christians. The books of Flavius Josephus help us keep on thinking. Listen to Sound Right Reason. Another character that Josephus, Flavius Piso / Arius Piso / Joseph Matthias Mattiyahu / Arius Calpurnius Piso / Joseph ben Matthias was the made-up character Paul of the New Testament. Here is the gematria. St. Paul comes out to 73. Joseph comes out to 73. Let's relook at this quote that was read early on page 50. Prophet or traitor. As a prisoner, Josephus claimed to have had a vision from God that Vespasian would become emperor, saying that it was revealed to him that God was using Rome to punish the Jewish people, and he himself had been chosen to announce these things. This so-called revelation did not go unnoticed by his fellow Jews as extremely self-serving. This is no other than the story of St. Paul's contradictory false vision on the road to Damascus that Mr. Piso made from his life from above. Let's look at some contradictory comparisons brought forth by this article. What really happened to Paul on the road to Damascus? It is not that Luke lacks correct information about Paul. It is that he interprets all he has from the viewpoint of at least 2 generations after Paul. By John Dominic Crossan, contributor. Emeritus Professor of Religious Studies, DePaul University. March 21st, 2012, 12:13 a.m. December 6, 2017. The vision of Jesus that changed Paul from a Pharisaic Jew to a Christian Jew happened, says Luke, Acts of the Apostles, on the road to Damascus. That event is so important that Luke records it 3 times for maximum emphasis. First, as it happens, Acts 9, 1-19. Next, as Paul tells it to the Roman officer in Jerusalem, Acts 22, 3-21. And finally, as Paul tells it to the Jewish king Agrippa II at Caesarea Maritima, 26, 1-18. Acts 26, 1-18. But that triple account, written around 50 years after Paul's death, has 2 major historical problems. Acts chapter 9, 1-9, the conversion of Saul. But Saul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogues at Damascus, so that if he found any belonging to the way, men or women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. Now as he went on his way, he approached Damascus, and suddenly a light from heaven shone around him, and falling to the ground, he heard a voice saying to him, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And he said, Who are you, Lord? He said, I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting, but rise and enter the city, and you shall be told what you are to do. The men who were traveling with him stood speechless, hearing the voice, but seeing no one. Saul rose from the ground, and although his eyes were open, he saw nothing. So they led him by the hand and brought him unto Damascus, and for 3 days he was without sight, and neither ate nor drank. Brothers and fathers, hear the defense that I now make before you. And when they heard that he was addressing them in the Hebrew language, they became even more quiet, and he said, I am a Jew, born in Tarsus in Cilicia, but brought up in this city, educated at the feet of Gamaliel, according to the strict manner of the law of our fathers, being zealous for God, as all of you are this day. I persecuted this way to the death, binding and delivering to prison both men and women, as the high priest and the whole council of elders can bear me witness. From them I received letters to the brothers, and I journeyed toward Damascus to take those also who were there and bring them in bounds to Jerusalem to be punished. As I was on my way and drew near to Damascus about noon, a great light from heaven suddenly shone around me, and I fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to me, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And I answered, Who are you, Lord? And he said, I am Jesus of Nazareth, whom you are persecuting. Now those who were with me saw the light, but did not understand the voice of the one who was speaking to me. And I said, What shall I do, Lord? And the Lord said to me, Rise and go into Damascus, and there you shall be told all that is appointed for you to do. And since I could not see, because of the brightness of that light, I was led by the hands by those who were with me, and came into Damascus. And one Ananias, a devout man according to the law, well spoken of all by all the Jews who lived there, came to me and standing by me to me, Brother Saul, and said to me, Brother Saul, receive your sight. And at that very hour I received my sight and saw him. Acts 22, 14-22. And he said, The God of our fathers appointed you to know his will, to see the righteous one, and to hear a voice from his mouth. For you will be a witness for him to everyone of what you have seen and heard. And now why do you wait? Rise and be baptized and wash away your sins, calling on his name. When I had returned to Jerusalem, was praying in the temple, I fell into a trance and saw him saying to me, "Make haste and get out of Jerusalem quickly, because they would not accept your testimony about me." And I said, "Lord, they themselves know that in one synagogue after another I imprisoned and beat those who believed in you. And when the blood of Stephan, your witness, was being shed, I myself was standing by and approving and watching over the garments of those who killed him. And he said to me, Go, for I will send you far away to the Gentiles." Paul and the Roman tribune. Up to this word they listened to him. Then they raised their voice and said, "Away with such a fellow from the earth, for he should not be allowed to live." On the other hand, Paul himself insists that his sight of the heavenly Jesus makes him equal in authority with the 12 apostles who saw the earthly Jesus. As he argues in his first letters to Corinthians, "Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen Jesus our Lord?" Acts 9:1. And later, last of all, as to one untimely born, he was also seen by me, for I am the least of the apostles, unfit to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God. Acts 15:8-9. One major conclusion from those divergent accounts is that Acts never gives Paul the title of an apostle sent by and therefore subordinate only to God and Christ. Paul is for Acts a messenger sent by and therefore subordinate to Jerusalem and Antioch. His call was emphatically inferior to that of the 12 apostles. Listen to sound right reason. The same way St. Paul lied that he was given spiritual authority to be an apostle with no facts, Mr. Matthias Piso, Joseph Flavius, lied that he was a prophet to gain favor with Vespasian to not be killed. St. Paul was being threatened to be killed for his past hate toward his fellow Hyksos Jewish kin. Mr. Matthias retold this same event that occurred in his life, but put Paul in his place for the New Testament. Upon arriving in Vespasian's camp, Josephus prophesied that Vespasian would become emperor. Josephus remained in Rome custody for the next 2 years until his prophecy came true, and Vespasian was acclaimed emperor June 69 AD. At that point, Vespasian released Josephus from his chains, and Titus was put in charge of the siege of Jerusalem. Again, Josephus took on the mantle of the prophet, imagining himself as Jeremiah, counseling the besieged occupants of Jerusalem to submit to the great power. Another point of interest to look at how St. Paul also spent 2 years in prison, the same as Josephus. Jews from Asia who hate Paul see him at the temple in Jerusalem and believe wrongly that he is bringing unconverted Gentiles into a part of the temple area where they were forbidden. They loudly accuse him of wrongdoing and stirred up a riot against him. The mob violently lays hands upon him and drags him out of the temple. As they begin to beat the apostle to death, the Roman army shows up and saves his life. Acts 21, verses 30-32. For Paul's safety, he is taken at night by 200 Roman soldiers to Caesarea. It is in Caesarea that Governor Felix resides, and that's where the trial against the apostle can be heard. Although Felix believes that he is innocent, he keeps him in prison for more than 2 years in the hope someone will offer a bribe to free him. Acts 24:26-27. Paul is eventually sent to Rome by ship in order to have Caesar hear his case. Another point Mr. Matthias / Joseph Piso put in the New Testament was how the Hyksos Jews of his time and Romans didn't trust him. Let's read the evidence. Josephus and his troops, who had taken refuge in a cave, were discovered by the Romans. According to Josephus' History of the Jewish War, Josephus had a close acquaintance under the dictate of Vespasian, who offered clemency from the Romans. However, Josephus was threatened by his zealot peers that if he were to take such an offer from the Romans, they, the zealots, would kill him. But Josephus argued that there was no reason to die when they could live under the Romans, who offered peace. Josephus' peers were not convinced, and the only compromise they offered was was a pact of collective suicide. It was then decided that instead of committing suicide, each soldier would draw lots to determine who was to be killed first and last. So this is the same parallel that Paul went through, that he was first against Jesus' disciples, was as Saul, chasing them down, getting permission and warrants from Rome to go lock people up, and even men, women, and children, and to get them killed. And they eventually put Paul's on him after he so-called became Paul and said he repent, and now he's for Jesus. And the people beat him, almost killed him. So the same thing Piso went through, because after he surrendered to the Romans and switched sides, he was now working for Rome to try to talk the Jews who wasn't trying to be up under Roman rule that they should take that position and they could trust him. And they wanted to kill Piso. So he got jumped too, and they put him in jail for a while because he was a turncoat. Curiously, Josephus drew the last lot, and so was left alone with one other, who determined with Josephus that they should take the Roman offer of clemency rather than kill each other. Thus, Josephus returned to Roman society peacefully, and after correctly predicting that Vespasian would succeed Emperor Nero's throne, he was granted a special position within the Roman government. A deeply Hellenized Jew, Josephus ben Matthias took the family name of Vespasian and became Flavius Josephus. He wrote many histories, including the Antiquities of the Jews, the Jewish War, and the life of Flavius Josephus. For some time, Josephus pursued a position as mediator between the Romans and Jews, but due to the distrust he had earned from both parties, his attempts were never successful. Now let us read how St. Paul, aka St. Piso, shaking our orbs, put this in the Bible to further glorify himself. Here's the gematria. St. Paul come out to 37. St. Piso come out to 37. Now compare this to the New Testament version of what Josephus said happened to him. After the Jesus of Damascus visit Paul on a road outside Damascus, Paul rushes to Jerusalem to see the 12 apostles, to tell them what happened. However, the Jesus of Damascus told Paul in a trance at the temple that the 12 apostles would not believe he met the true Jesus, and this Jesus told Paul to leave Jerusalem without meeting them for that reason. See Acts 22:14-22. When I had returned to Jerusalem and was praying in the temple, I fell into a trance and saw him saying to me, "Make haste and get out of Jerusalem quickly, because they will not accept your testimony about me." And the they in this particular quote in New Testament is the disciples. Okay? Acts 22:17-18. Side note, the same way Josephus Matthias Piso predicted Vespasian would become emperor, in the New Testament, Vespasian, disguised as Jesus, was telling Paul, Mr. Matthias Piso, he would become a free man, apostle, after the prophecy came true. However, the Jews in Piso's time represented the 12 disciples in the New Testament story he made up, would not trust him, Piso, aka Paul, because Piso/Saul went against the Jews for the Roman accolades. Yet in the Bible, Saul becomes Paul to support Jesus, who are the Jews wrapped up into one person, Jesus, aka Caesarion, in his day and time, 70 AD to 72 AD forward. This is Piso's way of showing his support for him turning his back on the Jews in 70 AD in reality. So he put his support of them in his writings. Remember, Mr. Piso refused to commit suicide with them. He rather live under the Roman rule than die in a war they couldn't win. This means that Mr. Piso was also Judas in the New Testament saga as well. Here's the gematria. Judas Iscariot comes out to 149. Alright, so we got Judas Iscariot at 149. Flavius Piso come out to 149. One and the same. Importantly, ask yourself, why could the Jesus Damascus not simply have appeared to the 12 as he did to Paul and convinced them Paul met the true Jesus? Why did this Jesus know the 12 would think Paul did not meet the true Jesus? Once you have this question in mind, then all the subsequent proof of the 12's ultimate rejection that Paul was invalid prophetic contact with the true Jesus makes sense. Even Paul's Jesus predicted that, yet Paul's Jesus felt incapable to intervene to change their minds. Then who do you think was this so-called Jesus whom Paul met outside Damascus? Good question. Acts 9:26-30 says, and when he was come to Jerusalem, he essayed to join himself to disciples, and they were all afraid of him, not believing that he was a disciple. But Barnabas took him and brought him to the apostles and declared unto them how he had seen the Lord in the way, and that he had spoken to him, and how at Damascus he had preached boldly in the name of Jesus, and he was with them going in and going out at Jerusalem, preaching boldly in the name of the Lord. And he spake and disputed against the Grecian Jews, for they were seeking to kill him. And when the brethren knew it, they brought him down to Caesarea and set him forth to Tarsus. Side note, Barnabas represented Vespasian's son Titus Caesar, Vespianus Augustus. All right, this is Vespasian, the one that gave Flavius Piso his freedom and gave him his last name. And this is Vespasian's son Titus, who ended up becoming an emperor. So this is Barnabas in the New Testament. And Vespasian was put into the New Testament as the voice of Jesus speaking to Paul, telling him that he gonna make him one of his disciples. All this is just the lies that Flavius Piso was pen pimping in one of his many stories of how he mixed reality with fiction and religion, trying to control the Jews of his time, which was what his father wanted to do, but Nero ended up killing him and he never accomplished that. So Flavius Piso, his son, ended up trying to do a more elaborate version of what his father was trying to do. All right, here's the gematria. See, Barnabas, also known as Joseph, and Josephus. So we're going to look at the gematria. And notice Joseph's name is there. Remember, Piso's name was Joseph or Josephus. All of this is how he played these word games, him and his family. So here you got Barnabas, Joseph, come out to 50. All right, and we talking about now Vespasian's son, whose name is Titus, Vespasianus Augustus, Flavius Vespianus. All right, when you put in his name, T for Titus, Flavius Augustus, come out to 50, which is the same as Barnabas Joseph, because that was the one in the story. Barnabas was taking Paul around the disciples to try to prove that Paul could be trusted, but in reality, Barnabas was Titus, who Vespasian, who gave Flavius his freedom and gave him power to go back into to Judea and be protected by Titus and the Romans whenever he was doing business for Rome, so they couldn't kill him. And this is what same thing we just read, how Paul was about to be killed by the Jews, and he was saved by 200 Roman soldiers. So all this is the same stuff that if you can see, Flavius is going in between what happened to him, and he just created the New Testament stories around that. All right. Remember, he had access to all of the Jewish old information, and that's how he was able to concoct a lot of the information that he had. Flavius, as Paul in his writings in the book of Acts, was protected by Titus, Barnabas, as Flavius, as Paul, was trying to convince the Hyksos Jews of his time that working with Rome would be beneficial because they couldn't win against them. Stay tuned for part 5, True Men to Peace and Wartime.
Let's go.